Hello, everyone. Ted, could you come up to the stage? Turn your camera and mic on. And so in this session, we're going to summarize, have each of the table leaders have some opportunities to summarize some of the key points that they would like to make about their discussions. And so I think we're going to start with Ted. Ted did not have time for a presentation, so he's going to have I'm going to be more fair with Ted and give him 5 minutes, and maybe we'll have an opportunity for a question or two, and then we'll move on to the next person. So Ted, could you summarize what you saw at your table, or what you'd like to report?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Vic, and thank you for inviting me. It's an interesting format. It's been an interesting day. I must admit, I'm pleased to see that I've got 5 minutes instead of the hour and a half that you had me down in the schedule, especially without much to say. So what I thought I would do is just go through some of the main highlights that came out of the discussions. These are probably some of my words. I'm putting words in other people's mouths, but I'll just go through them, and they're in no particular order. So one of the points that came up was a need to demonstrate the return. So there was tree improvement and EFM discussions, and the need and the ability to demonstrate that return is key if it's ever going to be used. Another point that came out was related to the static protected areas and a general agreement that in Alberta, we're headed in that direction. Whether we like it or not, there's more coming, and we will simply have to learn to deal with them. Another thought that came out was how much can forest industry and forest harvesting actually influence or deal with some of the problems that are coming at us. These are things such as even the large ones, such as climate change and the fire related to those, large insect infestation, also related to changes in climate. How much is the forest industry capable of dealing with it? Quantifying that and demonstrating that. And so that those limits are known and understood, because currently I don't think they are. And I think the discussion at the table was that those are not necessarily well understood. An interesting point came out of the discussions today. Like a lot of these sessions, I'm sure you go through and you say, well, that's really interesting, and your mind starts to think a little bit, and you say, well, how do I apply that in my real life? And that's really interesting. So the discussion that came out of that really was, yes, there's a gap between the research and the operational implementation of these. And it's not so much about learning about the research and the new techniques and the new outcomes that might come, that could potentially come from those. It's the mechanism to apply it operationally. How to cross that gap. Because it does make you think, and then what's a tool where I can actually implement this operationally on the ground. Another discussion we've had really was on policy and its impact on the decision to invest and not to invest. And I want to stress that this policy is not just government policy, but corporate policy. So and corporate inertia. And just because we have a large area of blowdown, which we would like to salvage, the mill might look at that and say, I don't really want that crappy timber in my mill. So how to deal with all of those pieces. What it sort of triggers is, how many people here know how to sell something new inside their institution? What are the mechanisms for that? How much training do you get for that in those processes, because you run into the same kind of decisions to change or how companies or institutions operate. And if we're talking about doing that, you have to be able to sell that internally. And what do you need to sell that internally? So when we discussed that a little bit, one of the things that came up is that you need a guarantee that the investment is actually captured. So in forestry, we have long-term investments. What's the guarantee mechanisms? Because if I can't sell that indeed we get to capture this investment, I'm not going to have any luck. So understanding what some of those mechanisms might be and focusing on ones that have perhaps shorter return, because shorter return reduces the risk. Now, return doesn't have to mean that just because I do this treatment over here, I get to immediately capture that treatment, as long as that investment can be captured in some form. So understanding that and quantifying that is really part of the pieces necessary to order to have new treatments or something different implemented across an organization. And related to that was perhaps what are mechanisms to protect that investment. So if I'm going to invest, because we in forestry invest in timber treatments that are also tied to pieces of land, you have to deal with both of those. And how can that investment be protected? It can be perhaps protected from disturbance. Some of those we have very little control over, and some we may have some more control over, but it might be other methodologies to capture that, such as remuneration. But those kinds of discussions and understood are probably needed in order to sell something that's different. Pardon me. One of the things we also talked about was, if we're going into a world where we may have to replan more often, if disturbances are bigger, what's a better mechanism to do that? And what's the limits to that? And one of the things we came up with was, well, consultation, both Indigenous consultation and other public consultation mechanisms. This has to already happen. It's just what is the process to make that more efficient, so that's not an impediment in planning rapidly and without large costs more often. It was noted, I think, that professional sign-offs might be one of the methodologies that's needed to do that. Perhaps they may have to be within certain thresholds where they're still applicable, and certain triggers would mean other types of review are required. After lunch, we talked a little bit about inventories, and those tools are limiting. And they become more limiting because we're expecting more out of the plans. These are the long-term plans that we're doing. We're expecting operational level detail to be put into that plan. And the tools that we have are really built for strategic. And so they begin to break down when you apply them operationally. I guess the last point I want to talk about was a little bit about other values and how we tie them in to our strategic planning processes. We're reasonably good at the timber values, not so good at forecasting other values. And while it may not be particularly our area to deal with forecasting a bunch of non-timber values, we may not really have a lot of expertise. One of the things that's really not understood is the impact of our treatments on other values. So if, for instance, we're going to have a lot more tree improved stock on the ground, does that have any impact on other values? Does that change recovery, water runoff recovery rates? In commercial thinning, what happens to other values? And there were some discussions on, I know I've seen it when you open up some of these stands on the richer sites, the understory explodes. You can't even walk through that. The ability to capture that in forecasting other values is missing. And if it is, then we really can't do a detailed trade-off between EFM treatments and other values and potential gains in allowable cut. And I guess the last part I want to just talk about is the sort of planning process that off the start, we usually are very close to a solution, and then we spend a lot of time and money refining that and dealing with a lot of, I'm going to call them self-imposed administrative technical rules that really don't change the solution very much. But they do impact our AACs, but instead maybe that investment and that dollars and time may go better into other areas than where we currently apply them. And so with that, maybe I don't know if I get any questions here, or Vic takes the control back.
I'm going to see if there's any. I don't see any questions, but maybe I'm missing them. Jeff, do you see any questions coming up? If not, I'm going to go on to Bev, and I thank you for that. And you'll probably get another chance to at the end of the session, Ted, to help summarize what the big topics that we brought forward. You and I will try to do that. So could Bev come up and Ted go off? Thanks, Bev.
Hi, Greg. I just made a few notes in a PowerPoint slide here, so I'm just going to share. So we had a little bit of discussion about inventory's role in timber supply. And a few comments that came up a couple of times. One, and Ted kind of alluded to this as well, is that inventory needs to be more timely. And one way we could do this would be to allow for continuous updates. Right now we're sort of time-stamped inventories. Some comments were around that current inventories are very tree focused, and we need to collect more ecological type information so that we can do some of that other non-timber modeling, or perhaps see what the effects of the treatments that are being used have on lesser vegetation. There's lots of interest in enhanced forest inventory. Right now we're seeing all across the country many new technologies that are based on satellite data, LiDAR, many different tools being developed. And so there is a lot of interest in that, in particular, so that a lot of these tools allow people to get at more detail than they currently have with the imagery-based inventory. And that was about it.
Thanks, Bev. I see some clap.
So unless there's some questions, that's all for me.
Okay, then let's go on to the next table. We'll call up Charles Knock. You can turn your camera off. Thank you. And mic off. And Charles, come on. Well, if Charles is not there, let's try Juha. Thank you, Yuha. Welcome. The Canadian Forestry Service, Northern Forestry Center.
Well, like I mentioned to my table a couple of times, I'm actually in Ontario, and I was hoping nobody would hold that against me if I'm at the. So I guess so. Yeah. So I was sort of a last minute addition to one of these breakout tables here, and I guess I had a little bit of interest in my topic, but not too much. So a lot of this will also be my reflections on what I heard from some of the other presentations. So I guess I come at this topic from like the perspective of like national scale analysis of climate change mitigation options in for forest carbon in the forest sector and Canada's greenhouse gas inventory and that kind of a perspective. So the system that that I'm part of operating for that, we use the same yield curve and inventory data as wood supply analysis would use. So, we have, when we're running these calculations for Alberta, we would have the inventories from Alberta and probably yield curves from Gypsy and things like this. So in terms of like the science, we have like one of the fundamental questions that we have when we are trying to improve our estimates in this system is the question around, how fast are the trees really growing? That's the way I describe it simply in my when I'm selling it sort of in my, I'm probably not doing always the best job, but that's sort of how I describe it simplistically when I kind of try to explain it to people who may not understand forest. But this is a fundamental question because answering that question affects not just the wood supply, but also if you're interested in how much biomass there might be available for various purposes, or what the amount of carbon sequestered in the forest is, or like the amounts of habitat for various things. This is sort of a fundamental question. And one of the I forget which presentation it was, but one of the presenters basically made what I thought was a striking point, is that there's relatively few people, and often a decreasing number of people, who actually understand how some of these models who do the work and that actually work on improving these kinds of estimates. So that's maybe there's sort of a disconnect between the importance of these kinds of estimates relative to the amount of people working on the problem. And so I guess I sometimes feel like one of the reasons why I wanted to attend this is to understand a little bit better how these kind of problems are addressed in sort of like a practical sense, because I feel like I often come at it from like this broad scale, sort of more academic perspective, where like in the scientific literature, if we look at the questions and answers to the questions of whether forests in Canada or in Alberta specifically are more or less productive now than they were over, in the last 100 years, say, there's often contradictory answers, where there will maybe some who find that, we're, because of factors like the fact that there's an increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and other factors, forests are growing much more quickly than they ever have in the past. There's also negative, observations where, because of factors like drought, such things, that we have declining forests. So if you look at there may be some degree of consensus around some of those studies and reviews of these things, but what this basically creates is sort of like an uncertainty in terms of your future projections, in terms of how forests will respond. And if the environment changes, you'll have changes to all of the stands that are out there, whether they're managed or not managed, and the degree to which they're managed intensely, etc. If you have environmental changes, it'll affect all of those stand types going into the future. And so I guess one of the I did have one interesting conversation around my table with somebody who I guess has some of the same problems that I do. So if you, in terms of like, how would I describe this? So I guess one of the other things that I'm sort of responsible for doing is for the models and the values that we generate for greenhouse gas inventory purposes. So I have this, I'm responsible for kind of calculating confidence intervals or errors around some of those numbers. And so, the degree of confidence that we have in these things is often lower than many people who make decisions would like it to be. And it becomes, I guess, an issue where, like, what we discussed is that, there's this, one of our observations is that, you have sort of biological science over here, in which, forest science is sort of more of a biological science, where the degree to our ability to sort of estimate things with precision is less than it would be in, in engineering or physics or something like this. And then, so there's often this disconnect between, like, the, I guess, the expected precision of estimates versus what models can actually provide. And then, so there was some question there. There was also another presentation that had the models are wrong and some are useful quote. And then it had the same question I often ask myself, is that how wrong do they have to be before they're not useful anymore? And I don't have a good answer to that question. And in many cases, for a lot of these types of projections and models that are being used now. And I think often that becomes because we don't want to think about the error that is or the sort of, not error in the statistical sense in the projections of the models that we use now. So I know that was some of I guess that's what I had to say. A lot of it was, I was quite happy to listen to some of the presentations that have been, and I've learned a lot from them as well. So.
Thank you, Juha. I think, Jeff, can Charles come up to the stage now, or can you bring him up to the stage?
And my mic's on?
You're good to go.
Okay, so just by way of a segue, I think would echo some of what Juha was just touching on. Some of the discussions at our table this morning and this afternoon, the ideas that climate change certainly can be a tough challenge to timber supply and growth and yield modeling due to those diverse influences of climate change on things like drought, but then also pests and pathogens and fire. So it really has these diverse and interacting effects that are quite challenging. Something that echoed with people from the morning session was certainly the idea of static or stability versus dynamic as a sort of driving idea, and in particular, not just in terms of like how we're managing the land base, but that the climate is also changing within this framework as well. And that was something that resonated with people. So saying, what are the implications for parks and other set-asides with respect to climate change? Just sort of have this hands-off approach. What are those implications? Something more on the social side but related to that static versus dynamic point was, in many ways, foresters have seen the areas that they've worked in or evolve, from that immediately post-harvest to a regenerated forest. And, in many ways, First Nations views of the land are also dynamic. And so something that came up is it just more that the mainstream public view is more rooted in this static idea. And then how do we go about, addressing that and changing that? So thinking about how that will require some more bridge building between these isolated stakeholders, if indeed these views of our systems are different. And of course, if there is an idea that we should be, managing on areas of the land base where we're currently not, how do you work towards, social license for that truly integrated management to happen? And there was a notion that we need to do that to address climate change. So just one final thing would be on that popped up was John Parkin's comment on the potential delinking of the industry and communities, and thinking about then the potential role for forestry and forest management in adapting forests to these ongoing changes associated with climate. So thinking about fire smart around communities, or even larger scale activities in the forest. Is this one area where that those links in that relationship then can be maintained or even increased or strengthened? So, and I would leave it at that.
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah.
I think that was a good summary, and the next summary I'd like to get from Jeff Mycock, if we could. Jeff, are you on the stage? Yes, there you are.
Yeah. Oh, and then I leave. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Vic. Yeah, so we at my table we had further discussion on the primary theme of the presentation around just around the state of our challenges in BC today related to resilience, related to a paradigm of static approaches, set asides, and where that's got us to, and then we compared and contrasted that with the Alberta context today, and certainly was clear that not as far along the path in terms of the challenges that we're facing, but there are definitely some things showing up, and so I think it was clear that there is opportunity to start to factor in some management approaches at the landscape level to start to adapt for resiliency, to start to adapt to things like potentially increased number of fires, size of fires, fire intensity, and including considerations in timber supply modeling that may not be fully capturing that in all cases today. I'm just trying to interpret what I heard from folks, and may or may not be entirely correct, but it seems like there could be opportunity to consider those further. Another one was around deciduous, and not necessarily just the amount of deciduous that's on the land base, but where it exists and how it exists in terms of what age groupings, and deciduous can again be an effective landscape level tool to control and influence fire behavior. So are we thinking about that? Are we planning for that? And what could we be doing differently? There were some good points brought up by more than one group around the fire management, fire protection folks in government, and the need or the opportunity, I guess, to better integrate them in overall forest management. And we've done that. We've seen that in BC as well. And I think we're to this day, it's an ongoing process that we're working on to integrate that group more into the day-to-day workings and planning and operations of forestry in general. So it sounds like there's a similar opportunity in Alberta to work on that and work more closely with those folks and build in their perspectives on fire management planning. There was also good discussion about silvicultural practices, and I asked the question: Are your young stands, are they providing a buffer to fire, or are they a conveyor to fire on the landscape? And so, things that come to mind are slash loading and the health and condition of your young stands, density of your young stands. Are you doing any commercial thinning or partial cutting treatments to, start to thin out those stands or prevent or capture mortality? We found, like another question was, is there any prescribed burning happening post-fire on harvested areas? And, ask those questions because in BC, we've seen clearly where that regime was in effect. Those are islands of green today in burnt landscapes, and they were significant buffers to fire and areas where fire could be controlled. Fire did not burn those stands. So really, really strong learnings for us there. Whereas younger stands, 10, 15 years old, lots of cases they were completely burned because the slash loads were too high. So if you're planting trees into young stands with high slash loads, you might be at high risk of never realizing a rotation there. Yeah, I think those were the main things. We did have some discussion on the influence of potentially static paradigms, and just like the last speaker mentioned, there is pressure for more static designations, and one of the key areas that was identified was in caribou management planning, and some folks offered that some of the caribou protection measures actually probably are moving you in the opposite direction of sustainability and resilience overall for the forest, and that's exactly the problem we face in BC. We've got to take a big step back and look at what's going to create a resilient, sustainable forest system, and then manage the values congruent with that system, not the other way around. If we impose values and ignore that, it's only a matter of time until those values will not be there. I think that was about it. There was a little bit of talk on partial cutting and the opportunity to increase it, but that summarizes the primary points. Thank you.
Sounds like you had a lot of discussion at your table, and I don't see any questions. Is Bob Winship at the main stage? Good to see you. Have to turn your mic on, Bob?
Sorry. Hi, Beck.
Hi.
Okay. From our group discussions we've had, by the way, my compliments to the people who participated, and very insightful and inspiring. Quickly, my notes would be, it's really all about policy, or however we define what policy is. So some of the conversation was about it's just outdated, not adoptive, and we need new definitions. How we have defined sustainability in the past is not turning out what it's looking like in the future. So-called policy needs to address new realities and challenges, be it from nature, wood supply, or socioeconomic conditions, and particularly global ones that are just far beyond our control. So the issue becomes, how do you move the policymakers to adopt? And is it a case of misinformed, not informed, or informed and opposed to change? We're really not sure. And who are policymakers? Are they elected leaders, or are they the people that we know right now? Another clear one, too, when we talk about policy, it should never be construed as necessarily target criticism against people in the ministry that we're familiar with, deals with forestry. We all know, and you can see from the speakers, is that on public land and forest resources and other natural resources, it's more than one ministry and a number of stakeholders. And more than ever, as practitioners or those who administer the act just for forests are feeling that we're not in the lead when it comes to areas of forested lands. Key theme was information. In a real systems approach to it, it is needed more than ever to sort of represent the forest state to policymakers and other influencers. There's clearly a sense of urgency. Uncertainty is increasing, including even the access to the current growing stock. So how do you address that risk and uncertainty for increased investments in silviculture and tree improvement? One of the ideas that's been pretty popular for a while, and is even mentioned recently and by the ministry, is the idea of public land zonation. For some, including myself, say I wouldn't advocate for that. It's still public land, subject to policy and the whims of the government of the day. So that being said, on the good news, some, including myself, would argue the extra money we're talking about for some of the speakers today is not that significant compared to the total cost of doing business right now. And it's less about the money and it's more about just why bother if you don't get a return in the terms of wood supply. That's what's really holding it back. So is it a case of disincentive or is it a case of lack of incentives, depending on how you see it? That's what we need to define the problem statement at. For sure, recurring theme on information and knowing your target audience for influencing is key. Foresters have talked about this a long time and tried it, but we really need to get the right information, but also get advice on how to communicate that information in this day and age. Look how elected officials and elected parties win elections. They hire ad people. They don't hire technical people like us to figure that out. So what information counts with public? And maybe again in the forestry profession, is it about policymakers, is it about elected leaders, or is it really what our target audience is, stakeholders, and those people who are interested in the forest and forest resource? Maybe we should be targeting them as well. So just a quick run through. Vic and Ted will be providing more detailed notes to you, but that's what I would report from what I heard from folks.
Thanks, Bob. That was great. I think we have to clean the stage off and start with a new group on the stage. So I'm going to turn the presentation off, and the remaining people who have not reported yet come back onto the stage. The rest of you leave, except for Ted Gooding.